Stop scrolling, because what I'm about to say may be one of the most dangerous developments in this war so far, not because of what has already happened, but because of what might happen next. For weeks, most people have been watching this conflict through one narrow lens: missiles, airstrikes, retaliation, interception, another headline, another warning, another map of the Middle East lighting up red. But right now, a far more disturbing possibility is coming into focus. And if it becomes real, it could change the nature of this war overnight. Because the next battlefield may not be a military base. It may not be an airfield. It may not even be an oil terminal. It may be water. And if critical water infrastructure near Tel Aviv were ever knocked offline in a sustained way, this would no longer be just a story about military escalation. It would become a story about civilian survival, national pressure, urban panic, and whether one of the most densely populated and strategically important zones in Israel can function under sustained infrastructure shock. That is why you need to watch this entire video. Because this is not just about a missile warning. This is about a nightmare scenario that military planners, intelligence officials, and governments across the region have understood for years, but rarely discuss in public until it is almost too late. Now here's what we know. Reuters reported this week that Iran's military has explicitly warned that if the United States follows through on threats to hit Iranian fuel and energy infrastructure, Tehran could target desalination plants and other critical infrastructure in the Gulf. Reuters also laid out just how dependent this region is on desalination for basic drinking water. In other words, the idea of water infrastructure becoming a target is not a fringe theory. It is now part of the open strategic conversation around this war, and that should immediately get your attention. Because once water enters the logic of escalation, the rules change. A strike on a military target sends one kind of message. A strike that threatens power, fuel, or water sends another. That message is simple. No part of normal life is outside the war anymore. And if that is the direction this conflict is moving, then Tel Aviv is one of the places where the consequences would be felt fastest, hardest, and most visibly. Now let's slow this down and look at the bigger picture. The war that began on February 28th after coordinated US and Israeli strikes on Iran has not stabilized in the way many officials initially hoped. Reuters reported that the White House stepped back from a more triumphant public presentation of the ceasefire because the terms remained too fragile and too uncertain. At the same time, negotiations are still expected, but major issues remain unresolved. That means this is not a settled peace. It is a tense pause layered on top of an active conflict, and fragile pauses are dangerous because they create the illusion of control at exactly the moment when all sides may still be calculating their next move. Iran has taken serious damage. That much is clear. But Tehran also still has leverage. It still has missiles. It still has drones. It still has regional pressure points. And perhaps most importantly, it still has the ability to threaten the infrastructure that makes normal life possible far beyond the front lines. Reuters reporting on desalination plants and the Strait of Hormuz makes one thing very clear. This conflict is no longer only about battlefield success. It is also about strategic pain. That is the first thing to understand. Here is the second. Most people hear air defense and imagine a shield. But real air defense is not a shield in the science fiction sense. It is an exhausting, expensive, high-speed contest of detection, command decisions, inventory, reloads, and constant triage. Israeli defenses can intercept many incoming threats, but modern missile warfare does not only test whether you can intercept. It tests whether you can keep intercepting over time while under pressure, while protecting cities, while uncertainty grows, and while your enemy keeps looking for targets that create disproportionate disruption. And that is why infrastructure matters so much, because not every strike has to kill a large number of people to have strategic effect. Some strikes work by paralyzing systems. A hit on transport does that, a hit on energy does that, a hit on communications does that, and a hit on water infrastructure can do that in a way that sends fear through an entire population almost instantly. Think about a city region like Greater Tel Aviv. Even rumors of severe water disruption would trigger anxiety. Confirmed disruption would do far more. Hospitals, housing towers, emergency services, sanitation, food distribution, cooling systems, public confidence, and civil order all begin to feel the pressure very quickly when water security becomes uncertain. This is especially true in a high-tempo war where missile alerts are already straining daily life. Now, to be very clear, I have not found reliable confirmation that Iran has destroyed Tel Aviv's last water plant. I have not found reliable confirmation that 8 million people have no backup. Those claims appear in sensational videos and social media posts, but not in the high-quality reporting I checked. What is verified is the broader danger. Infrastructure like desalination and water systems has moved into the threat picture, and governments in the region know how catastrophic attacks on those systems could be. And that brings us to the real question. What happens when a war moves from trying to destroy military capability to trying to stress a society? Because that is where things become much darker. A missile warning linked to Tel Aviv is not only about where a projectile lands, it is about what it forces Israel to defend, what it forces planners to prioritize, and what it signals about Iran's evolving strategy. If the message from Tehran is that normal civilian systems are fair game under escalation, then the purpose is not simply destruction, the purpose is compression. Compressing the defender's choices, compressing public morale, compressing the line between military war and societal war. That is how infrastructure targeting changes the equation. Now here's where the United States comes in. Reuters reported that Washington is still trying to manage a ceasefire framework while also confronting the Hormuz crisis and broader regional instability. That means the U.S. is not dealing with a single military problem. It is dealing with several clocks at once: the diplomacy clock, the energy market clock, the military escalation clock, and the allied reassurance clock. When those clocks start ticking together, American alert levels rise, not because one thing has already gone wrong, but because too many things could go wrong at the same time. And infrastructure attacks are exactly the kind of trigger that can set multiple clocks racing at once. Why? Because an attack on water or desalination is not easy to contain politically. Hit a radar site, and the story stays military. Hit a water lifeline, and the story becomes humanitarian, strategic, economic, psychological, and political all at once. That is the kind of event that can force governments to respond more aggressively than they intended. That is the kind of event that can turn a tense pause into a wider escalation. That is the kind of event that can push the U.S. from deterrence and diplomacy into a much harder posture. Now step back and think about what makes this so dangerous. Iran does not necessarily need to physically destroy every critical system to achieve strategic effect. Sometimes it only needs to make those systems feel vulnerable. Sometimes the threat itself changes behavior. A credible threat against water infrastructure forces emergency planning. It forces resource reallocation. It forces defensive repositioning. It forces governments to publicly reassure populations while privately preparing for worst-case scenarios. In other words, the threat becomes part of the attack. And this is where sensational headlines often get one thing right, even when they get the details wrong. They capture the sense that modern war is no longer only about front lines. It is about lifelines. Water is a lifeline. Electricity is a lifeline. Fuel is a lifeline. Shipping routes are lifelines. And Reuters reporting on the Gulf's dependence on desalination and the continued disruption around the Strait of Hormuz shows just how exposed those lifelines really are in this conflict. So, is Tel Aviv in immediate collapse? No. Is there verified evidence that the city's last water plant has been destroyed? No, not from the reliable reporting I checked. But is there a growing, credible fear that this war could move deeper into critical civilian infrastructure and that water systems are now part of the risk map? Yes. And that may be even more important than a single viral claim. Because once civilians begin to understand that the next phase of the war could reach into taps, hospitals, neighborhoods, and the mechanics of ordinary life, the psychology of the conflict changes. This is no longer just about surviving attacks. It becomes about surviving instability. That is the point where even a heavily defended state begins to feel strategically stretched. Not because it cannot hit back, not because it cannot intercept, not because it has lost control, but because every new threat demands more attention, more munitions, more readiness, more redundancy, and more political discipline at the exact moment when everyone is already under strain. This is why the next few days matter so much. If talks hold, infrastructure threats may remain just that. Threats. If talks weaken, the list of possible targets could widen. If escalation returns, military systems, energy systems, maritime systems, and water systems could all be pulled deeper into the war. And if that happens, the question will no longer be whether this conflict is dangerous. The question will be how many layers of normal life can be put under pressure before the region slides into a much larger emergency. That is what makes Tel Aviv such a critical symbol in this moment, not because it is defenseless, it is not. Not because a single headline proves catastrophe has already happened, it does not. But because Tel Aviv sits at the intersection of military significance, civilian density, financial centrality, and psychological impact. Any serious threat to the systems that sustain life there instantly becomes more than a local issue. It becomes a regional signal, a message, a test. And that is exactly why U.S. officials, Israeli planners, and regional governments are all treating this phase of the war with such caution. Because when water enters the escalation ladder, nobody can pretend the conflict is still narrow. At that point, the blast radius is measured not only in craters or casualties, it is measured in fear, pressure, and how fast an entire society begins to realize that what keeps it alive may now be part of the battlefield. So here's the bottom line. The viral title may overstate what has already happened, but it points to a danger that is very real. Iran has openly signaled infrastructure escalation. The The region is deeply vulnerable where water is concerned. The ceasefire remains fragile. The US remains on edge, and Tel Aviv remains one of the most important pressure points in the entire conflict. So the question now is not just whether the next missile gets through, it is whether the next phase of this war is going to target the systems people cannot live without. Because if that line is crossed, this conflict will stop looking like a conventional exchange of strikes and start looking like something much more serious, a war against lifelines. And once that begins, the real panic will not start when people hear the explosion. It will start when they turn the tap and realize what this war has reached.